today we are talking all things overboardedness. And if you're wondering what that is, well, that's a busy director. That's one person who may hold multiple board seats. And we're wondering if that really is something that might interfere with the efficiency of that person's ability to play the oversight role on a board and for governance overall in South Africa. And so we didn't want to have the conversation in isolation. We made sure that we have a strong panel to really speak to us about this. So joining us on the line is Parmi Natesan. She's the Chief Executive Officer of the Institute of Directors in South Africa, and also Rehana Cassim, that is Professor of Law at UNISA's Department of Mercantile Law and Deputy Editor of the SA Mercantile Law Journal. Good evening to you both. Thank you so much for your time.
Good evening, Noluthando.
All right, Parmi, I think maybe we can start with you and really speak about overboardedness, and maybe you can help us really streamline the definition. When do we say a person is just overboarded?
I think it's a very difficult question, and I don't think you can actually put a number to it, whilst I think people would love to do that. I think what we firstly need to understand is that being a director, and specifically being a non-executive director, is an extremely onerous role and responsibility. It's got legal duties, and there's also legal consequences if those duties aren't fulfilled adequately. Therefore, anyone taking on a non-executive directorship must ensure that they have sufficient time capacity to be able to fulfill their role effectively. So I know many people will ask, what does that mean? And I think it depends on the individual. You can have individuals who are only serving on boards as non-execs, and there they can probably take up to 4 or 5, seems to be the number that research shows. But then again, you can have a non-exec who's also got a full-time executive job, in which case only 1 or 2 would be able to be done properly in addition to their full-time role.
Now, Prof. Cassim, good evening to you. And, I'd like you to weigh in because you have penned an article here that basically says, look, it might be good for a person to sit on more than one board. They're able to, bring some knowledge and experience that they might even get from their peers or from just the experience of having a board seat along with them to a certain company. But there's that risk that exists that they just might not be able to contribute meaningfully or as effectively as they could as a result. Talk to us about this dynamic that needs to be balanced here.
Good evening, and thank you for having me. You're quite right. Yes, there's definitely a risk when directors sit on too many boards. They run the risk that they cannot attend sufficient board meetings or properly oversee or monitor the board that they serve. And as you know, directors are fiduciaries to their company, which means that they must act in good faith with loyalty and in the company's best interest at all times. And when they are not able to pay sufficient attention to all the numerous boards they sit on, they run the risk of breaching their fiduciary duties. And this means that they can be personally held liable for any loss suffered by the company as a result of the breach. There's also other consequences. For example, if they neglect their duties or inflict harm on the company simply because they don't have time to pay attention to each board, they can even be declared delinquent, which in South Africa will disqualify them from holding office as a director for 7 years or longer. And another important consideration is that when directors serve on too many boards, it can cause complicated conflicts of interest for directors, especially when they serve on the boards of competing companies, which can also result in a breach of their fiduciary duties. So they need to be very careful.
So, Parmi, I'm very keen to find out, because I think one of the things that does contribute to overboardedness is then this limited pool of people who may qualify here. But I know that the IODSA is constantly trying to create a new pool, a new cohort of directors to come in and take up these roles. Let's talk about the flow through your structures and processes and how we are, how we're successfully placing new faces at this level of executive management in South Africa.
Sure. So I think firstly, I don't believe there's too limited a pool of non-executive directors. I believe people are out there who have the time and have the director competencies to be able to serve organizations well. I think where we're going wrong is the way in which appointments are filled. So far too often you'll see there's a vacancy on a board and people will ask around the table, okay, who do you know that we could invite to join this board? So it's very much a case of who knows who, and that's why we end up with seeing the same faces and names on a number of these boards. So I think we need to open up the way in which non-executive directors are recruited onto boards. I think that will already make a big difference. The second thing also that's so important is the due diligence that's done when directors are appointed, because I think that too sometimes can get neglected. So we're looking for whether an individual has the necessary knowledge, skills, and experience to be able to serve on that board. We're looking for whether they have the personal and social competencies to serve, as well as the moral compass to do what's right for the organization and not necessarily what's right for them. And then obviously we're looking as well as to whether they have the time capacity. And one of the key questions the nominations committee should be asking when they're interviewing a candidate for their board is whether there's sufficient time capacity. And it's not only about whether they just have time for that company or those 4 meetings, because there's also a misconception where people think, oh, well, being a non-executive director seems like a lot of money for just 4 meetings a year. There's a lot more than just 4 meetings a year. You can basically double the time alone with the prep that's going to be required to prepare for those meetings, apart from just attendance of meetings. There's research to be done to keep on top of your game in terms of what's happening in that industry so that you can add value. Then there's also often board committees that individuals will need to serve on once they've joined the board. So I think the time is extensive, and that needs to be properly discussed and elevated at the nominations committee level. The one thing we picked up with COVID as well is if people are so stretched that basically their time is all occupied by boards, the minute there's a crisis and one of those boards needs more time from them, they then struggle to fit it in. So there also needs to be some spare capacity in an individual's diary so that in times of crisis they can still serve the organization well.
That's very interesting, Parmi, because, you are then also making reference to the quality that a person can contribute as a result of them, sitting on one or multiple boards. So, Prof. Cassim, I'm very keen to find out from your perspective if you think that, I'm not sure what the King Code says, and maybe you can touch on that for us, but if there should be a way of us to kind of regulate this. We know that at this point everything is treated on a case-by-case basis. But, should we be playing a little bit more hardball in this regard?
I think that it is best to determine the number of boards of directors should sit on a case-by-case basis because, it does depend on the director's experience, capabilities, knowledge, and commitment. But I do think that we do need to be very careful that we don't run in a situation where directors are sitting on just far too many boards and not paying proper attention to what they are doing. And generally, I agree with Parmi that you can't really say how many is too many. But generally, it's thought that if you're sitting on 3 or more boards, perhaps then you are already becoming overboarded. And I think that companies and nomination committees should pay attention when appointing directors on how many other directorships the director currently holds, and also look at his experience and that director's ability to manage their duties. And another important consideration, I think, is transparent disclosure. There must be disclosure from directors on what they're doing and how many other boards they're sitting on to make sure directors are not overboarded. And I think it would be a good idea for companies to have their own policy on what suits the particular company. For example, F&B has a policy on overboarded directors where they actually limit the number of non-executive directors to holding 4 seats on publicly listed companies. And when I say 4 seats, for example, a chair position would count as 2 seats, an executive director might count as 3 seats. So I do think that we do need to take a bit of a hardcore line, and companies should come up, especially public listed companies, with their own rules on where they think too many seats is actually now becoming overboarded.
I'm also keen then, to find out from you here with the matter of ESG emerging, and this is the trend. I think Parmi was saying, staying on top of the game here. But as ESG emerges, is it possible that this is something that companies may decide to take to draw a line in the sand about? This is something that might be more prescriptive, like you're saying, Prof. Cassim, that F&B, for instance, they're very, very clear on what their mandate is here. And if companies did decide to, that they would have that burden of deciding that it would be 3 boards or 4 boards, would that be something that directors could push back on as a result? Because for instance, a person could say, I have the capacity, I'm retired, or whatever the case may be. And Parmi, we'll start with you.
Sure. So I think, firstly, yes, ESG has gained a lot more prominence over the years, but the E and S and G, economic, social, and governance aspects have been around for a very long time, maybe with different words. So yes, I think there will be greater prominence of this overboarding issue. And I think also the fact that King 4 requires an integrated report, and the integrated reporting framework requires certain disclosures, as the other speaker has mentioned already, it already brings these things and makes them transparent for us as stakeholders. So I think that's very important to note that I think we're moving in the right direction. I also wanted to add, just on the point of companies having their policies, is yes, I absolutely agree. I think every company should be thinking about this, especially our large listed and even our large SOEs. But I also think there's a place for the regulators. So, for example, I know in the financial services industry already we have the Prudential Authority being quite strict around the number of other boards that board members of the banks, etc., can serve on, going to the extent of even looking at how much time they spend on each company and requiring timesheets and that sort of thing. So I think that's also a step in the right direction. I think we need more discussion on this at AGMs. I feel like too little is discussed on this resolution where directors are put forward for re-election. I think more could be discussed there on their attendance at meetings, their preparation for meetings, and whether they have the capacity to be re-elected.
And Prof. Cassim, would you like to weigh in on this one?
Thank you very much. I agree with what has been said. I also think that we shouldn't have a solid number. There should be some flexibility because it should be determined on a case-by-case basis and depending on the director's experience. But I think there should be some sort of ballpark figure. And another important point is that when we have board evaluations, and a company should be having board evaluations at least once a year. And this is also a point where companies should focus on whether the individual directors at that point are overboarded, so that steps may be taken at that stage to manage this, so that we do not run into problems at a later stage. But yes, I do think that more attention needs to be given to this issue, and that companies do need to take a bit more initiative to make sure that directors are not being overboarded.
1948 on Power Business, we continue our conversation on overboardedness. And if you've just joined us, that's really the concept of a person sitting on so many boards that it might, interfere with their ability to have proper oversight over the company whose board they sit on, and also might neglect the fiduciary duty that comes with being a board member. And joining us for this conversation is Professor of Law at UNISA's Department of Mercantile Law and editor of the SA Mercantile Law Journal. That's Professor Rehana Cassim, as well as the CEO of the Institute of Directors in South Africa. That's Parmi, Natesan. Now, thank you so much both for staying on the line. I'd like to weigh in now on, overboardedness and it possibly being a barrier to the kind of transformation that we're trying to see on listed entities. And I say this because, like you say, Parmi, you mentioned that the way in which it might work, somebody might say, Parmi, do you know somebody? And you nominate somebody that might look like you, come from the same community as you, and so on. And so the process, what it does is that it leaves out, women, it leaves out people of color, it leaves out young people, because they would not be the people who are being recommended here, but also the same people keep sitting on the same boards, and so they all keep recommending each other. Parmi, I'd like you to please weigh in.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we know that we need diverse boards. We know that diverse boards make better decisions, and it's ultimately in the best interest of the organization and its stakeholders if that board are not thinking alike, are challenging each other, are looking at problems from all different angles because of the different viewpoints that they come from. So I think it's critical. And yes, people just referring other people onto boards will probably not result in that diversity, because we tend to know people who are similar to us. And I do think it's important that boards and nominations committees start opening up these gates to how they fill positions, and particularly looking at diversity. So, how many women are on that board? How many people of color are on that board? How many younger people? What's the average age on that board? Believe it or not, we still have boards in South Africa, and I saw one not very long ago that's 100% male.
Sure.
And in their governance reporting, they'll say, but we're committed to gender diversity on our board. But there's no way, if you are committed, that you haven't been able to find a competent female to serve on that board. I just wonder how hard were you looking?
Absolutely. And Prof. Cassim, could you weigh in on this one as well?
Yes, thank you. You're quite right. South Africa presents a unique case study because there is pressure on listed companies to improve their board diversity, both in terms of race and gender. And a study that was done in 2019 on 1,600 directors of listed and unlisted companies found that of them, 1/3 of them were overboarded. And the people who are the most overboarded, very interesting, is that it was mostly black women over the age of 60 who were serving as independent, non-executive directors that are the most overboarded. And I think this also relates to the fact that, this group of persons are in high demand, and perhaps we don't know of many other black women over the age of 60, and so the same people tend to get invited to serve on boards quite often. And this is where the study found that this is where the highest amount of overboarding takes place.
This is very interesting Prof. Cassim, and I'm wondering also if that could emerge from a certain, generation that emerged post 1994, for instance, that would have been the people who were first to arrive as educated black women in corporate South Africa, and then capable of taking up these positions. But of course, then what happens there is that younger women of color are not getting the room that they should probably be getting.
Yes, exactly. And I also think it's a case of maybe the same people get invited because we know them and we're familiar with them, and maybe some of the others do not. So that is also something, we do need to make sure that we do look at a wider pool, because currently it appears that we have a limited pool. We might not, but because of the amount of overboardedness and the demand of certain race and genders, it looks like we do have a limited pool. Maybe not necessarily in practice, but that is the appearance that is created.
I'd like to also speak about shareholder activism and maybe how shareholders could also be the drivers of this kind of change. What we are seeing is that shareholder activism is gaining lots of traction in South Africa and really, entering very complex spheres of business and governance in companies. So, Parmi, is this another group of, people that could also be driving this issue of overboardedness and also, act as an oversight, play that kind of role of oversight in this regard?
Absolutely. And I think more than just oversight is one of the shareholders' most important duties in a whole governance ecosystem is appointing the directors. And I think that there's much more the shareholders could be doing, asking questions. Why are we putting forward this individual for re-election when they serve on so many other boards? Why are we not bringing in women on this board? Why are we not bringing in people of color? Why are we not bringing in young people? Whatever the questions are. I think more and more questions are being asked, but I don't think it's at the level that it needs to be. Often you'll see in an AGM, there's a lot of debate and discussion and passion around the other resolutions like remuneration, for example. I often see that the director resolution simply passes and without that much interrogation into the candidates that are being put forward for voting.
And Professor Cassim, would you like to weigh in on this issue of shareholder activism?
Yes, thank you. We are starting to see shareholders raise issues, I think, more at the moment with director tenure. A lot of issues have been raised with director tenure, but it is also starting with director overboardedness, but probably at the moment more so in foreign countries. For example, you might have heard of the case last year where shareholders of Twitter voted against the re-election of the Twitter director, Egon Durban, because they thought that he held too many board seats. And he was a director on 7 public company boards at the time. He then agreed to reduce his board seats to 5, and despite objections from shareholders, Twitter still kept him on. But later he did lose his board position, in any case, after Elon Musk took over the company and dissolved the board a few months later. But shareholders are becoming more aware of the issue, and they are raising a lot of concern, and also is becoming more of an issue in South Africa, although maybe not as much, but hopefully they will start getting more active on this issue.
I do have a WhatsApp text here. The person hasn't given us their name, but they want to know if overboardedness can affect independence for a non-executive director. Parmi, would you like to answer this one?
I think it goes back to the point that Rehana raised earlier around conflicts of interest. So how many boards can you serve on while still remaining independent on a single board? Because at some point, another board that you serve on is either a competitor, a supplier, somehow related in some or other way to another organization that you serve on. So I think it can impact independence, yes.
Now, earlier when I was doing my reading, actually Harvard had done the study on overboardedness, and part of that study reveals that, companies where directors are overboarded actually just don't perform as well, and that they're likely to miss very important detail, especially if, certain board directors head up specific committees within the board and so on. So in my mind, there's already a performance, a risk there, and that's the most important risk for me. But it seems that this is not something that that has been brought up until recently, when this research has gained prominence. Rehana, can you talk to us about that issue of just performance?
Yes, it's a very good point. So first, I don't think we must generalize too much, because it will depend on the individual director, his own knowledge, his experience, and so on. So someone sitting on many boards, might handle it very well, especially if he's a non-executive director, where someone with less experience might not handle it as well. But the performance issue certainly comes in when it comes to attending board meetings and also preparing for board meetings, because a lot of work, as already been pointed out, goes into that. And I think that where companies must be very careful is that they must make sure that they do proper board evaluations to make sure that their directors are performing. And I think that is also where it may come out, that if a director is not performing, could it be that he's just overstretched? And it just really does not have capacity. And if that is the case, then companies must take steps to manage that problem. But I completely agree that performance does become an issue when you just don't have time to dedicate and monitor each board that you are sitting on.
Now, Parmi, talk to us about this conversation. Where does it need to go for us to really start having it far and wide, for companies and board chairpersons as well as shareholders to really be at the fore of trying to manage this process, so that we're not letting things fall through the cracks, especially in South Africa, where we are seeing, a few corporate scandals that really could have been avoided, in one way or another.
So I think firstly, what I mentioned earlier is we need more detailed due diligences done before appointments are made to boards in general. And then secondly, when people are serving, so once they've already been appointed, there needs to be better monitoring and tracking of their performance, their attendance, their preparation, etc. And then consequences. So, for example, if someone's overboarded and they're constantly missing meetings, or they're attending all the meetings, but it's clear that they haven't opened the pack, there should be consequences in that they shouldn't be then re-elected to that board. I think the more we can see consequences, the more people will start taking it seriously.
And Rehana, are you in the of the same thought with Parmi, that evaluation of potential board members is the most important aspect in us making sure that we are not letting people get overboarded?
Yes, completely agree with that. I would just add that disclosure is very important as well from directors. The King 4 report recommends that potential non-executive directors must give the board details of their other board positions and also written statements confirming that they have enough time to fulfill their board responsibilities. So the responsibility is also on the directors themselves. Before accepting new appointments, they must carefully consider their increased risk of liability if they neglect their duties due to being overextended. And directors themselves should avoid accepting more directorship that they can handle. So it's also for them to make sure that they are not taking on too much, because they run the risk then of harming the company and putting the company and themselves at risk.
Well, I'd like to thank you both so much for this, very informative conversation today, speaking about overboardedness and really, the kind of responsibility those who are on boards, those who look after boards, those who, appoint board members all have in ensuring that those who do serve and have the correct level of capacity to be able to do so as efficiently as possible. That is Rehana Cassim. She's Professor of Law at UNISA's Department of Mercantile Law and Deputy Editor of the SA Mercantile Law Journal, as well as Parmi Natesan. She's the Chief Executive Officer of the Institute of Directors in South Africa.